In a congressional hearing broadcast live, Stephen Miller cut off Jasmine Crockett 6 times, each strike sharper than the last. The chamber gasped. The nation's pulse thundered. On the 7th, her words landed like a hammer, and silence swallowed him whole. What truth could break a man so loud in front of millions? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The red tally lights snapped on, and the word "live" flashed across every screen in America. The chamber froze under that glow. Even the marble seemed to hold its breath. Every cough, every shuffle sounded like a crack of thunder. In living rooms and diners, in hospital waiting rooms and quiet bars, people leaned forward. Forks paused. Coffee cups hung in the air. Millions of eyes locked on the screen, sensing this wasn't going to be another dull hearing. Something was coming. Stephen Miller entered like a shadow made solid. He didn't walk. He prowled. Chin high, eyes sharp, his steps slow but heavy, claiming the room before he even spoke. The stack of papers in his hand looked less like notes, more like blades ready to cut. Behind him, his aides sat stiff and silent. Dark suits, blank faces, like guards flanking a general. Their silence said everything. They weren't here to guide him. They were here to witness the fight. Across the table sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her hand pressed firmly on a thin brown folder, the kind people overlook, but it carried the weight of a storm. Her other hand rested on a legal pad, steady, like she was anchoring herself to the ground. She tapped her pen once, twice, 3 times, each tap sharp, like a clock counting down. It wasn't noise, it was warning, a beat of control in a room that was about to spiral. The chairman's gavel hit the block, but it sounded hollow. Cameras adjusted, zooming in tighter, hunting for tension. Somewhere in the back, a producer whispered, "Stay on her face," and the lens obeyed, pulling Jasmine into focus. Stephen Miller adjusted his microphone. His papers trembled, whether from the air vent or his own hand, no one could tell. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. The battle lines were already drawn, his voice sharp and overbearing against her silence, cold and steady. The hearing hadn't started yet, but the stage was set. A predator at one table, a fighter at the other, and between them a country waiting to see which one would strike first. The gavel's echo faded, and Jasmine leaned into her microphone. Her voice was steady, calm, but carried through every corner of the chamber. "Mr. Miller, do you acknowledge the psychological trauma caused to thousands of children by family separation?" The words barely left her lips before Miller lunged in. His tone was sharp, fast, like a blade slicing through air. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is the danger of open borders." He cut her off once, then twice, not answering, only drowning. The sound cracked through living rooms across the country. A veteran in Ohio slammed his fist on the table. A school teacher in Georgia shook her head at the TV. A nurse on night shift whispered, "Let her finish." The interruptions weren't just in Washington. They reached into every home. Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted the folder in front of her, tapped her pen once against the pad. Her eyes never left Miller, steady like stone. Every viewer could see it. She wasn't rattled. She was waiting. Miller pushed harder. His words tumbled fast. Practiced lines about traffickers, about security, about chaos at the border. He raised his voice as if volume could erase truth. The chairman half-heartedly tapped his gavel, but the noise rolled on. Inside the chamber, the tension thickened. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed closer, catching the defiance in Crockett's eyes and the fury in Miller's. The contrast was stark, one calm, the other unraveling. People at home felt it. They leaned forward, restless. Some shouted at their screens, as if their voices could reach the chamber. Others sat in silence, fists clenched, knowing exactly what it meant to be talked over, dismissed, ignored. Crockett lifted her pen again, her posture unchanged. She waited for the storm to burn itself out. And in that waiting, she owned the moment. The interruptions weren't hurting her. They were building something. Momentum, proof, a stage set for what was coming next. Miller's voice crashed over the chamber again. The third interruption came like a hammer, louder than before. He spoke of chaos, of danger, his words spilling fast, desperate to control the frame. The chairman tapped his gavel, weak, drowned by the noise. The fourth cut landed almost on top of her reply. Miller leaned forward, eyes sharp, jaw tight, pouring words like a flood. His tone was clipped, aggressive, more performance than answer. The hearing was no longer dialogue, it was a show of dominance. By the fifth, frustration flickered in the room. Reporters exchanged glances. Even some Republicans shifted uneasily, sensing his fury was starting to unravel. His voice filled the air, but it carried strain now, an edge of panic under the bravado. Crockett did not raise her voice. She didn't fight to squeeze in a word. Instead, she lowered her eyes to her notepad and wrote something down, slow and deliberate. Each stroke of her pen seemed louder than his shouting. The sixth interruption came like a crack of thunder. Miller jabbed his finger at the air, his words a blur of statistics and blame. He wanted the nation to hear his power, but what America saw was a man afraid of silence. The gavel knocked again, softer than it should have been. The chairman's warning carried no weight. Miller was holding the floor but not in control. He was unraveling in front of millions. The red light above the cameras burned, recording every slip. Jasmine sat still. Her hand rested on the folder, her eyes locked on him with a calm that cut sharper than any shout. She let him speak, let him drown himself in noise, and in her silence she gathered strength. 6 interruptions, 6 failed attempts to erase her voice. The stage was set, the air electric, the tension ready to snap. When a man interrupts 6 times on live TV, what will happen the 7th time? Miller's voice came fast, relentless, like rain pounding on a tin roof. He didn't pause to breathe. Border security, human trafficking. Obama did the same thing. His words tumbled over each other, stacking high, forming a wall meant to block the truth. It wasn't explanation, it wasn't accountability. It was noise sharpened into a weapon. The 3rd interruption bled into the 4th, then the 5th. He wasn't answering Jasmine Crockett. He was talking over her, trying to erase her from the hearing altogether. His jaw tightened as his words spilled faster, louder, as if sheer volume could rewrite history. The microphone shook from his pounding breath. The cameras swung to the gallery. A mother clutched a picture of her child, her eyes wet, shoulders stiff. A veteran's fist pressed into his knees, the veins in his neck straining. A teacher bit her lip, whispering, "This is cruelty, not strength." Faces across the room told the story he refused to admit. Tears, fury, silence brimming with disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching across pads like frantic thunder. Photographers snapped in bursts, freezing the moment of a man unraveling. Even the chairman's gavel sounded thin, powerless against Miller's storm. Tap after tap, swallowed whole by the force of a voice trying to drown the chamber. Crockett stayed still. Her pen moved slow, measured, like a heartbeat in the chaos. She wrote, paused, underlined, then placed the pen down again. Every motion was deliberate. Every line she drew was another piece of evidence he had given her. She didn't fight for space. She waited, letting his storm reveal the cracks. Miller jabbed his finger at the table, then at the gallery, his face flushing red. He invoked danger, chaos, invasion. Each word dripped with desperation, not confidence. He leaned forward so far, it seemed the table itself was holding him back. But his eyes darted, restless, betraying the fear behind the fury. The tension in the chamber grew unbearable. People shifted in their seats, breaths short and shallow. Viewers at home leaned in, restless, caught between rage and anticipation. Some shouted at their TVs, demanding silence. Others gripped their hands tight, knowing this wasn't just a hearing. It was a battle for who controlled the narrative and who would be silenced. Miller pressed on, pouring out everything he had, but every word, every deflection, only tightened the pressure in the room. The storm wasn't drowning Jasmine Crockett. It was building around her, circling, waiting for the moment she would let it collapse under its own weight. The storm of Miller's voice raged on, but Jasmine Crockett finally moved. She straightened, lifted the thin brown folder, and slid out the first sheet. Her voice was calm, cutting clean through the noise. This memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services warns that separating families would cause significant and long-lasting psychological damage. Babies as young as 8 months old, Mr. Miller. 8 months. The chamber froze. She laid the paper flat on the table, and the sound of it landing, Fitch, echoed like a gavel stronger than the chairman's. Reporters raised their heads, pens still in midair. In the gallery, a woman gasped, covering her mouth. The truth was no longer abstract. It was printed, signed, undeniable. Miller leaned in, his jaw grinding. Those documents are biased. They don't reflect the full context of border security. He cut across her words again, his voice sharp, rising with each syllable. His interruptions had lost the polish of control. Now they were jagged, defensive, desperate. Crockett did not raise her voice. She reached back into the folder, pulled out another sheet, and set it down. Fitch. This report from Customs and Border Protection confirms there was no system in place to reunite these families. None. Not one plan, Mr. Miller. Her words dropped like hammer blows. Each page was a strike. Miller tried to push back, his tone bordering on a shout. The real trauma was caused by smugglers, by the failed policies before us. His finger jabbed at the desk, his face flushed. But the more he spoke, the less it sounded like authority. It sounded like a man cornered. Jasmine's eyes never left him. She pulled a third page, this one heavier, with an email chain highlighted in black ink. She placed it on the table with deliberate force. Fitch. And here, your own words. Quote, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations. Other considerations, Mr. Miller, were children. The room cracked open with murmurs. People in the gallery shook their heads, some with tears in their eyes. Reporters looked at one another, stunned. Miller sat rigid, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles pale as bone. His storm was collapsing under the weight of paper, and Jasmine Crockett, calm and relentless, had just begun. The sound of those papers hitting the desk traveled far beyond the chamber. Within minutes, the clips were online, hashtags rising like sparks in dry grass. Let Her Speak flashed across Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Millions were watching not just the hearing, but the duel at its center. Stephen Miller's face burned red. His neck tightened, veins rising under the skin as he leaned forward into the microphone. His words came louder, faster, each one more forced than the last. He wasn't answering anymore. He was fighting for air. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes fixed on him with quiet defiance. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every second of her silence was a mirror, reflecting his unraveling back at the nation. Reporters in the room typed furiously. Photographers snapped close-ups of Miller's clenched jaw, his lips pulled tight, his forehead wet with sweat. The contrast was brutal, a man in free fall beside a woman, steady as stone. The story was writing itself in real time. In the gallery, people stirred. Some shook their heads, others whispered under their breath. One woman wiped her tears, whispering, "Finally, someone's holding him accountable." Even a few Republican staffers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting away from the spectacle. At home, the country was split. In kitchens, bars, and break rooms, people leaned forward, glued to the screen. Some shouted, "Let her finish!" Others sat in stunned silence, watching the imbalance unfold. What they saw was more than politics. It was power stripped bare. Miller pushed harder, jabbing his finger, voice cracking as he tried to outshout the weight of the documents on the table. He wanted to project strength, but what came out was noise, sharp and hollow. He looked less like a witness and more like a man caught. And through it all, Crockett did nothing but wait. Wait for the storm to break itself apart. Wait for the silence to grow so heavy it would crush him without her lifting a finger. The hearing had turned. The nation could feel it. How do you defeat a man who believes volume equals victory? The storm of Miller's voice didn't slow. He roared about smugglers, border chaos, and American safety, each word flung like a stone. His finger jabbed the air, his chest pumped, his jaw flexed with anger. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood with nothing but noise. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded tight. Her pen lay untouched, her papers stacked neatly. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even shift. She sat there steady as stone, watching him unravel. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She had stopped trying to break into his storm. Instead, she let the silence grow, pressing heavier with each passing second. Every rant, every outburst, every jab of his finger landed against a wall of calm. His words didn't sound like power anymore. They sounded hollow, bouncing against marble walls with no place to go. The chairman's gavel tapped once, twice, thin as paper. The sound vanished under Miller's voice. He barreled on, spilling statistics, dates, deflections, swinging wild at shadows. But the silence on her side of the table was louder than the pounding of his words. It wasn't just silence. It was a verdict. The cameras caught everything. One lens zoomed in on Miller's face, red, sweaty, veins etched like wires. Another cut to Crockett, arms folded, eyes locked, expression carved in stone. Side by side on the broadcast, America saw the contrast. Rage versus resolve, fury versus focus, a storm screaming into the void. In the gallery, the air felt sharp. People leaned forward, their breaths shallow, waiting. A woman clutched her child's photo tighter to her chest, eyes wet. A veteran shook his head, whispering, "She's letting him hang himself." Even the reporters slowed their scribbles, realizing the silence was the story now. At home, the country felt it too. Living rooms, diners, break rooms went still. People leaned closer to the screen, not to catch Miller's words, but to watch her silence. It was a silence that burned, a silence that said more than shouting ever could. Miller's voice cracked. His rhythm stumbled. He thought her stillness meant weakness. But the truth was sharper. She didn't need to take the floor. She already owned it. And with every second she stayed silent, his own voice became the evidence against him. The silence had stretched until it felt unbearable. Cameras zoomed closer, waiting for her move. Then Jasmine Crockett lifted her head, eyes locked on Stephen Miller. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Mr. Miller, you have interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you've shown this committee and the nation watching exactly who you are." The words hit harder than any gavel. Miller's mouth twitched, ready to fire back, but something in her tone stopped him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was final. A line drawn in marble. The gallery stirred, a low murmur rolling like thunder. Crockett leaned forward now, her hands folding calmly on the desk. Her voice grew stronger, steady as steel. "Men like you interrupt women like me because you mistake volume for wisdom. You interrupt because you know the evidence will tear through the story you've built. And you interrupt because deep down, you're afraid of the truth." Miller blinked hard, his jaw clenching. His hands gripped the table so tight his knuckles turned white. The cameras caught every flicker of panic, every bead of sweat breaking across his forehead. The storm of his words had collapsed into a trembling silence. And then came the strike. Crockett's voice didn't rise. It dropped, low and deliberate, heavy enough to crush the air. "You may have separated families, Mr. Miller, but you cannot separate yourself from the consequences of your cruelty." The room froze. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The words didn't echo. They sank, settling in the chest of everyone listening. Miller's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time, the architect of family separation was silent. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Hashtags sparked to life online, racing across screens. Crockett strikes. Truth over volume. In homes, bars, and hospital waiting rooms, people whispered, "Did you hear that?" Millions did. Millions felt it. In the gallery, a woman began to cry softly, her tears cutting through the hush. A veteran pressed a fist to his chest. Even some lawmakers on Miller's side shifted uneasily, avoiding his eyes. The strike had landed. The nation had seen it. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She sat back, calm, unshaken, as though she'd only stated a fact. And Miller, once the master of control, sat pale and wordless, trapped in the silence he could no longer command. For a heartbeat, the chamber held its breath. Miller sat pale, lips parted, but no words came. Jasmine Crockett's strike still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. And then, it broke. The gallery erupted. Applause burst like a wave, rolling over the marble walls. Some people wept openly, clutching photos of their children. Others stood to their feet, shouting, "That's right!" The sound was raw, uncontrollable, impossible to contain. Cameras clicked in rapid fire. Flashes strobed across the room, freezing Miller's stunned face, Crockett's steady gaze, the crowd's rising emotion. Every angle was captured, every second immortalized. The footage was already racing to millions of screens. Even lawmakers couldn't hide. Democratic members rose, clapping, their voices drowned in the swell of the gallery. Across the aisle, some Republicans looked down, eyes fixed on their papers. A few turned their shoulders to avoid the cameras, the shame written plain on their faces. The chairman's gavel slammed, sharp and frantic. "Order! Order in the chamber!" But his voice was lost in the roar. The room was no longer his to control. The moment belonged to her. At home, the eruption spilled into living rooms and break rooms. Hashtags shot to the top of Twitter. "Let her speak. Crockett strikes. Truth over volume." On Facebook, the clip spread with captions like, "She silenced him without raising her voice." Millions replayed it, some with tears, others with fists pumping in pride. Reporters raced to push out breaking alerts. Miller silenced by Crockett flashed on phone screens across the nation. Cable news cut live, anchors pausing mid-segment to replay the exchange. Commentators called it historic, the kind of moment that would outlive the hearing itself. Inside the chamber, Miller shrank into his chair. His once booming voice had vanished, replaced by silence heavier than chains. He shuffled his papers, but the weight of the room pinned him down. Crockett sat composed, hands folded, her face unreadable, her calm louder than the storm she had just endured. The sound of the gallery refused to die down. It wasn't just noise. It was a verdict. It was America saying, "Enough," and it carried far beyond the walls of Congress. What happens when silence becomes louder than any shout? The eruption in the chamber didn't stay in the chamber. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Twitter feeds lit up like sparks on dry grass. Facebook timelines filled with captions, "She shut him down with truth." On YouTube, the video soared into trending, millions hitting replay, watching the strike again and again. CNN broke from its programming to air the full exchange. Uncut. Anderson Cooper leaned forward in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. "In 20 years, I've never seen Stephen Miller this silent." The screen replayed Crockett's words, the silence that followed, the explosion of the room. Viewers across the country felt chills run through them all over again. Fox tried to pivot. Their anchors spoke about border security, about current immigration issues, but their guests dragged it back every time. "Look," one conservative commentator admitted, "Miller walked into a trap. He should have let her speak." The tension was obvious. Even on friendly turf, the clip was unavoidable. MSNBC was jubilant. Joy Reid beamed as she rolled the footage. "This," she said, "is what happens when you try to bulldoze a black woman who came armed with facts." He thought interruption was power. She turned silence into the kill shot. The panel around her nodded, some laughing, some shaking their heads in awe. Then came the political tidal wave. Barack Obama tweeted the clip with a single line, "Grace under pressure, truth under fire." It racked up millions of likes in hours. President Biden released a statement calling the hearing a reminder of the wounds family separation left behind, and why we can never repeat that cruelty. The White House press room buzzed with energy, and then Trump chimed in. His Truth Social post was defensive, sputtering. Stephen Miller ambushed by radical Democrat, witch hunt, but the fire was gone. The words felt thin, a recycled script without the weight he once carried. Even his supporters seemed quieter than usual. By nightfall, hashtags dominated every platform. "Let her speak," "Truth over volume," "Crockett strikes," comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories of being silenced, interrupted, dismissed. Crockett's strike had cracked open something bigger than one hearing. It was no longer about Miller versus Crockett. It was about every voice ever told to sit down and stay quiet. The wildfire spread faster than anyone could contain it, and America leaned closer, not to watch Miller anymore, but to watch what Jasmine Crockett would do next. The viral moment didn't just live on screens, it stepped into the courtroom. Lawyers across the country clipped Crockett's documents into their filings. Exhibits once buried in government drawers now sat in the open, stamped and cited. Her voice in that chamber became part of the legal record. Constitutional scholars weighed in. Some called it a turning point in congressional oversight. Lawrence Tribe told reporters, "She didn't just silence Stephen Miller, she entered evidence into history." The words spread, echoed in classrooms, law reviews, and podcasts dissecting every second of the exchange. Then came the judges. In lawsuits brought by families torn apart at the border, rulings began to cite the hearing. A federal judge in California pointed directly to Crockett's documents, noting that the administration had clear warnings of trauma, but pressed ahead anyway. Another judge in New York wrote, "As Congresswoman Crockett revealed, the cruelty was not incidental, it was intentional." For the families, those words mattered more than any headline. Mothers who had been told to stay silent now saw their pain acknowledged in black and white. Fathers who once thought no one in power cared replayed the clip of Crockett saying, "Other considerations were children." It felt like the first time someone had carried their cries into the halls of power. Community centers buzzed. Support groups gathered around TVs, watching the moment again, tears streaming as they whispered, "That was for us." Therapists said children pointed at the screen and asked, "She's talking about me, right?" For families broken by policies, the hearing wasn't just politics, it was validation. Even in Congress, the ripple spread. Bills were drafted citing Crockett's evidence as justification for change. Hearings that once blurred into partisan noise now carried the weight of precedent. What she placed on the table had become a weapon in the hands of justice. Stephen Miller's silence echoed louder now, not just on TV but in legal briefs and courtroom halls. Every time his name appeared in a ruling, Crockett's strike was there too, shadowing him, tying cruelty to consequence. For years, families had wondered if their stories mattered. In one afternoon, Jasmine Crockett turned their pain into proof, and for the first time, they felt not invisible, but heard. The impact of that strike stretched far beyond politics. Across America, women began sharing their own stories. On talk shows and office meetings, over kitchen tables, the words were the same. "I've been interrupted too." Crockett's silence and strike gave them language for a wound they had carried in silence. Social media filled with testimonies. Teachers spoke about being cut off in staff meetings. Nurses remembered being talked over by doctors. Daughters recalled dinner tables where their voices never finished a sentence. Each story carried a familiar thread. What Miller had done on live TV, millions of others had felt in their daily lives. And then a phrase was born, pulling a Crockett. It wasn't about shouting louder, it was about flipping the script. It meant staying calm, holding steady, letting arrogance reveal itself, and then striking with truth. Companies used it in diversity trainings. Students wrote it on posters, activists printed it on t-shirts, bold letters blazing across city streets. Meanwhile, Miller's world shrank. Speaking invitations dried up. Conferences that once paid six figures quietly pulled his name from the lineup. Conservative hosts hesitated to book him, afraid the clip would overshadow every word he said. His greatest weapon, his voice, no longer carried the same weight. On Capitol Hill, his influence eroded overnight. Lawmakers who once sought his counsel kept their distance. His op-eds landed with a thud, dismissed as hollow. Even allies avoided eye contact when his name surfaced in hearings. He had become the face of interruption and the cost of it. For Crockett, the cultural tide lifted higher. Editorials praised her composure, her patience, her precision. Women's rights groups hailed the moment as a lesson in power dynamics, a blueprint for turning disrespect into strength. Her name was in vogue not just in politics, but in boardrooms, classrooms, and community meetings. The chamber that once shook with Miller's storm had rippled into something bigger, a reckoning. People were asking deeper questions about whose voices get heard and why. A single exchange had cracked open a national conversation about respect, authority, and the value of listening. Miller lost more than a debate that day. He lost credibility, his platform, and the illusion of control. Jasmine Crockett, with patience and precision, had turned his arrogance into her proof. Can one woman's words reshape how a nation listens? The viral strike could have been the peak, but Jasmine Crockett didn't stop there. She walked back into Congress with a draft in her hands, the Family Protection Act. Its promise was simple but fierce. No child would ever again be torn from a parent's arms as a matter of policy. It was bold, it was human, and it demanded a response from both sides of the aisle. Some in Washington whispered it was impossible. The divide was too wide, the scars too deep. But Crockett pressed forward. She spoke not with anger, but with conviction. "This is not about party," she told the cameras. "This is about children, about families, about who we are as Americans." Her words cut past politics into something deeper. She didn't stay behind the marble walls of D.C. She went back to communities, the same places that had carried her voice into the hearing. In Dallas, she stood before students, telling them their voices mattered no matter who tried to silence them. In Houston, she listened to veterans, some who said the hearing gave them hope that truth could still win. In community halls filled with immigrant families, she promised to fight until their pain was more than a headline. Everywhere she went, the echoes of that hearing followed. Young women raised their hands to say, "I want to pull a Crockett someday." Older men in ball caps shook her hand, whispering, "We're with you." Mothers who had once been silent stood up to share their own stories. The movement was no longer hers alone. Inside the Capitol, lawmakers felt the pressure. Constituents called, wrote, demanded action. A few Republicans, wary of standing against a tidal wave of public sentiment, cautiously stepped forward. They co-sponsored her bill, their names added to the list that grew longer by the week. The Family Protection Act was no longer just an idea. It was alive, moving, impossible to ignore. Crockett knew this was only the next battle, not the last. But with each step, each speech, each hand she held, the strike she landed on Miller was transformed into momentum. What began as silence in a chamber was now becoming law in America. Maria Santos stood before the cameras, her voice trembling but steady. She had been separated from her 3-year-old son for 8 months. "That one sentence," she said, "healed something the government broke." She wasn't alone. Her words echoed what thousands of families had carried in silence. Clips of reunions played across the news. Children sprinted into their parents' arms, clutching them so tightly it looked like they would never let go. Fathers dropped to their knees, overcome by the weight of holding their kids again. Mothers sobbed into their children's shoulders, whispering promises that no one would take them away again. Advocates shared these reunions with pride. They said it was more than a headline, it was repair. Crockett's strike hadn't just silenced Miller. It had opened a door for families to feel seen, to feel whole. For the first time, their pain was treated not as numbers or statistics, but as human truth. Maria described the moment she saw her son again. "He looked older, like he had lived years in those months. But when he wrapped his arms around my neck, I felt like we were home again." Reporters wiped their eyes as she spoke. Viewers at home whispered, "This is what justice looks like." The ripple spread further. Community halls held vigils of gratitude, parents lighting candles for children still waiting to reunite, churches filled with prayer, voices rising for healing. Across America, people who had never thought about immigration policy before suddenly saw it in the faces of children who had lost months, even years, with their parents. Crockett visited shelters and community centers where families gathered. She didn't give long speeches there. She listened. Parents told her about nightmares, about children waking up crying in the night, about the small victories of feeling safe again. Each story fueled her resolve. Each tear carried into the laws she fought to pass. The strike against Miller had turned into something larger. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about repairing lives, about stitching families back together where government cruelty had torn them apart. And for families like Maria's, it was proof that one voice could force a nation to listen. The chamber was still. Reporters had put their pens down, cameras fixed in place. The gallery hushed. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice low but steady, every syllable carrying the weight of the nation. "They can interrupt our voices," she said, "but not our truth." The words cut deeper than any shout could. They landed with the force of everything that had led to this moment. Every gavel strike, every interruption, Every document slammed on the desk. The gallery broke first. Tears rolled down cheeks, hands pressed to hearts. Then came the applause, slow and heavy, rising until it filled every corner of the room. Across America, living rooms and break rooms echoed with the same emotion. Viewers wiped their eyes, clapping at their screens, whispering her words back like a vow. In a church basement in Ohio, an old veteran stood and saluted. In a kitchen in Texas, a mother hugged her child tighter. The hearing had become something more than politics. It had become a mirror. Even lawmakers felt it. Democrats rose to their feet, applauding openly. Some Republicans looked down, unable to meet the cameras, but the silence around them spoke volumes. For once, the divisions blurred. It wasn't about party lines. It was about truth, raw and undeniable. Crockett didn't move as the applause roared. She let the sound wash through the chamber, her face calm, her hands folded. It wasn't triumph in her eyes, it was resolve, a reminder that this fight wasn't over, that her words were not an ending, but a beginning. Her voice lingered long after she stopped speaking. On screens, in streets, in classrooms, people repeated it again and again. They can interrupt our voices, but not our truth. It became more than a statement. It became a challenge. Whose voices will America choose to protect? The powerful few or the silenced many? If this story moved you, don't just scroll. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that give voice to the silenced. The next chapter has already begun, and your voice belongs in it. What part of this story stayed with you? Leave a comment and let's remember together. This dramatized story is drawn from real events and public figures. The characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary, education, and inspiration. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't over. It's just waiting for someone to hear it.